Good morning. How are we doing today? My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit. Welcome to episode 5 of my vlog. In this one, we are back in Orange City, Florida, playing a little 1-2. And this time, we finally get a little lucky and get a piece of that high hand bonus that I see every single time I go to play here, but I never get a piece until this session. So let's review some of the hands from it, including the big hand that generated that extra $500 high hand bonus. Without further ado, let's jump right into it. So this first hand is early on in the session. We are in the small blind. There's a button straddle for 5. Small blind is going to act first. Look down at 9-8 suited and decide to complete here. This is a little bit loose to say the least, but for what it's worth, when I play in games that have like 100 big blind max buys, I tend to play a little bit more gamblery early on. I'm okay if the image gets good. I'm okay if I lose and have to rebuy to another 100. I also like to try to get deep as fast as possible. So I will sometimes get a little bit splashy in spots that I shouldn't necessarily, and this will kind of be one of those. So there's a raise under the gun to 20, call by middle position, folds around, I flick in the call. Again, pretty darn loose considering the SPR that I'm going to be getting involved in, whether or not the big blind continues. They do end up folding. And we end up going to a flop three-way of Jack 8-4 rainbow, giving us a backdoor flush draw and middle pair. And I decide to lead out for 25. This is just one of those where I don't really want to check and have to face a $40 bet from anyone or a $50 or a $60 bet. So I kind of control it a little bit from that point of view. I also don't really want to get this checked through, and I don't know. I just see this doing a lot of good things, and I'm totally okay kind of regardless of what happens. So the original raiser goes away. The other player thinks not too long and then flicks in a raise up to 65 total. So these are always tough because it's one of those where timing means a lot, and the way someone looks and is reacting physically means a tremendous amount. And sometimes these make difficult hands to convey in a vlog, but something about his timing, something about his physical movements just didn't seem real, if that makes sense. Like, just something wasn't adding up in this case. And already I'm getting 4-1. I have a pair, I have backdoor draws, and while we don't have a lot of stack depth, I think my pair could definitely be good a decent chunk of the time. Again, because I'm not assuming that his raise is tremendously strong, even though it maybe should be, but something just wasn't feeling that strong in this particular hand. So chips get dragged in. Turn is the 10 of hearts. I check. They check behind pretty quickly. River is the Jack of hearts. Fills up that backdoor flush draw. And before I could even get my check out, he decides to shove. So this is one of those where I really think, again, didn't make a lot of sense on the flop, didn't feel particularly real. And what I'm thinking about in this situation is if he had a strong hand, right? If he had, I don't know, a set, or if he had even top pair or anything like that on the flop, is he really going to check the turn behind, right? Because the turn makes it so if it goes check check right there, the river could put out 4 straights. So I don't think like pocket 8s is going to check behind on that turn. I think they're going to put it in right that moment and feel pretty darn comfortable. Same thing with Jack X, same thing with whether you improve with Jack 10, whatever. I just don't think he's going to check a lot of his strong hands behind on that turn, which means that this Jack on the river doesn't really change very much. Because again, I don't think like Ace Jack or whatever Jack X hand would ever kind of take this raise, check behind turn, and then shove it in right here line, especially given the fact that he beat me in the pot. I didn't even check yet, and he had already fired. So the story is just not really adding up for me. So I think for a little bit, and end up flicking out the call, show my hand, he ends up showing ace 4, and we end up shipping this one. So again, it's kind of one of those weird ones where it's like, what are you really representing? Just doesn't make any sense with that turn check. Something felt weird with that flop raise in the first place. Now, don't get me wrong, I put in way too much money here pre-flop with stuff that was not particularly good or worthwhile. But still, this is one of those where sometimes you're going to make those pre-flop blunders and you have to make the post-flop good actions. And this is one that just happened to work out in our favor, which is pretty good. But really make sure to pay attention when those things just aren't really adding up, especially when they would always bet on cards that, would likely scare them and they don't want to let free cards roll off, their check there can mean a tremendous, tremendous amount. So that's hand number one. Let's knock on to hand number two. All right, so about 15 minutes later, we find ourselves in this spot on the button. There's a raise from our friend in the previous hand from earliest position. I have ace queen off. Cutoff goes all in for 40, and here we are. And while this isn't the most interesting spot in the entire world, it's still worth a quick discussion on the pre-flop thought process. So at this stage in the game, we have a couple different options. We can call or we can come over the top, but I would never ever fold this, just 20 big blinds in general against a cutoff shove. I'm not going to fold ace queen, just not going to happen. The other guy also rebought 400 instead of max buy, so that makes things a little bit easier too. The two players in the blinds both have, decent sized stacks with me, but I'm not overly concerned. I don't think they're going to make many plays, whether or not I come over the top here or just call. So I really like call here, giving the player that we beat in the previous hand a chance to get involved as well, probably too lightly, and I'm just going to take ace queen to the felt a good chunk of the time here. So pretty easy spot, I think, to definitely make sure you're giving action, and I think call is going to be a little bit better. So big blind sweats me out for a while and finally ends up mucking. Original raiser folds as well. Both show our hands. Big blind says he had our exact hole cards. Not a great sign for me. Cutoff does say that I'm going to win. That I like. And end up nailing a queen in the door, ace in the turn, brick on the river, and ship a nice little small pot over our way. So again, not the most exciting hand in the world, but definitely one of those that's worth a small consideration pre-flop. Just make sure you're not folding. But again, I like calling a little bit more given the exact variables in this precise hand. A little while later, we are on the button. It's a bunch of limpers to us. Look down at ace deuce suited, decide to limp behind. I don't really see too much reason to raise here. Limping behind and playing this multi-way is going to be just fine. Small blind goes away, big blind checks, and go a billion way to it. Flop is ace 10-8. Totally rainbow, no hearts to speak of, and everyone is going to check around to us. And I decided to fire for 10. I know a lot of players will just consider checking this behind here and just playing turns out, but honestly this is a much better fire, especially when you're the one closing action. You're going to get continuance from a lot of second best hands anyway, and you just make decisions on turns and rivers, not too complicated. We end up getting called in one spot. Turn is the deuce of diamonds. Fire for 20 after getting checked to. Totally fine with the fire. Obviously, it's totally for value. I could be behind occasionally, but I don't think I'm going to be behind very often. Lots of second best hands can and will continue. So rock and roll. Get called. River is the ace of spades. They check. And I decide to fire the river for 110. And this is one of those where I think a lot of players in my opponent's spot here are going to level themselves into thinking that this is only done with a light hand. It's obviously probably going to be very polarized typically, but I think he's going to make a lot of mistakes against this, especially when he has like sticky 10x or sticky ace-x, whatever. And he even says like, I'm pretty sure you missed, and gets to talking himself into making a call here. And this is one where obviously you can miss a tremendous amount of value, and I just think against players who are going to look at you and say, yeah, I don't really believe you, you can definitely make sure to punish this very high. And come to find out, after tabling my hand, I actually have the high hand. There's about 20 seconds left in the high hand. There are no qualifiers for it for this period. So I have 20 seconds to hold on, and I limp in with the absolute worst possible qualifying hand of aces full. So aces full of deuces is going to check that box, and this is good enough for a quick $500 win on top of the pot that I ended up shipping. So no complaints whatsoever. But even from a strategic point, this is very, very important to make sure that you get that river bet and that you bet all three streets, that the sizing is right, and that overbet on the river, honestly, is really, really, really good, especially against players who are thinking. They see you as kind of loose and splashy, and that was definitely my image at this point. Getting paid on this overbet is something that can happen a lot more often than you might realize and can really help you maximize these rare times you have these kind of more hidden monsters. Definitely be on the lookout for them. So end up winning the hand plus a nice little $500 high hand bonus. And without further ado, let's jump on to the next hand. Right about 6 minutes later, this hand ends up coming up. There's an under the gun straddle for 5. Down at ace king suited. Not complaining about hand selection so far. 2 callers in front of us. Decided to raise this up to 30, totally standard sizing, obviously going to be raising, so no real questions so far. The original straddler calls, the second caller calls, and we end up going 3-way to a flop. Flop is 7-5-5 with 1 club, rainbow overall. They both check over to me, and I fire for 35. And this is one where I think a lot of players here will have a lot of like double overcard kind of hands, and I'm fine if they call, I'm fine if they fold, and obviously I don't expect them to fold pairs or anything like that, but we do have some stuff going for our hand. I do think I'll get the occasional fold from at least one of them, occasional double fold as well. End up getting called in both spots, and turn is a 3 of clubs. Think for a moment and decide to check this behind. And I think this is definitely worth a consideration on a barrel. I'll probably do a more complete video on this full hand later, but this is one of those where, given the stack sizes, we can still get stacks in on the river when our club comes, when the ace or the king comes, and we're comfortable with that, just because, you know, the pot is really bloated at this point and it's not going to be difficult to do so. It's roughly 1 SPR at this point. So I don't really see much reason to fire here, unless you think there's just a bunch of like double overcard stuff you can, 1, get them to fold right this moment, or 2, you don't really think you're going to be able to show it down. I don't think I'm getting any folds from pairs at this point. If anyone has a 7, obviously if anyone has a 5, that's not going anywhere. If anyone has even pocket 6s or pocket 8s kind of hands, I don't think that's going anywhere. So I don't see a tremendous amount of reason to fire here. I think checking behind is going to be just fine, and we'll play rivers and go forward from there. So as it totally runs out, the river is a 9 of spades. Not my favorite card in the world. Just end up checking it behind because someone could definitely have something like 6-8 or 8-9 or 7-9 kind of hands again. I don't really think that pair stuff is going to end up folding. One of the callers shows ace jack. I flip up my ace king, the other person mucks, and we end up winning a nice little pot with ace high. So I was not necessarily expecting to win this 100% of the time, but it is one of the benefits that can happen sometimes when you play this kind of pot out, instead of just checking the flop behind, then facing a turn bet that you're really never going to be able to give action to. Definitely consider making some bets on those flops instead of just always taking that check back. So that's this hand. Let's go on to hand number 5 right now. So that other table ends up breaking, and we end up going over to a new table. We're in the cutoff with queen 10 off, 2 limpers in front of us, attack to 15. Totally standard on the raise, totally standard on the size. Not really too concerned. Haven't been at this table too long, maybe 10 minutes, give or take. So we end up getting a limp call from the second person and end up going heads up to it. Flop is ace king 5 with 2 spades. We do have a backdoor spade draw and the gut shot. They check, decide to fire out for 15, and totally fine with the c-bet, totally fine with the size itself. This is one of those where I'm probably going to get folds like 25 to a third of the time, give or take. So when they continue, I'm not super shocked. Turn is the 3 of clubs, putting up a backdoor flush draw. It doesn't really impact us in the slightest. They check and decide to fire out here for 25, and they very quickly let it go. So This is one that I think a lot of players won't even bother reviewing. It looks like a pretty typical barrel. Some players, of course, will just be too passive and check this behind 100% of the time. But this is a really, really good spot to double barrel. If you think about what your opponent could possibly continue with on that flop, like, are they really looking forward to a barrel? And more importantly, are they really looking forward to a triple barrel? And the size is done in such a way that it sets up a nice pot on the river that, one, you can get enough second best continuance on the turn bet, and there's plenty enough hands that are going to absolutely hate life for the large bet on the river that will just absolutely melt, versus bet too big here, then all of a sudden they start talking themselves into commitment. So that's why I like kind of the 25-ish dollar bet on the turn and then follow it up with a nice big one on the river. Big question I ask myself is, if they had a hand as strong as, let's say ace jack or ace 10, if they're likely going to end up folding that to the triple barrel, it's probably a really, really good spot to set it up, because if they're not going to continue with like their best one pair hands, it's probably a really good spot to get aggressive, turn on the gas, and fire, fire, fire. So that's the thought process here. Again, ship a nice little small pot and onwards to the next hand. A little while later at the same table, look down at 7-8 suited under the gun, decide to open 2-6. A little bit loose, but this is the kind of table where pots were definitely not going multi-way. Players were playing very tight pre-flop, so thought could either get this away pre-flop for a little under the gun steal or get it heads up a decent chunk. End up going heads up in this situation against the small blind. Big blind gets out of the way, end up going heads up to a flop of 10-7-5 with 2 diamonds. They checked us pretty quickly. Fire out for 15. Think I can get a decent amount of continuance from some second best combos, and we'll just kind of make decisions and go out from there. Totally fine with the bet. You could make an argument for betting 10 instead of 15, but I think 15 is going to work a little bit better the way that this game is playing. Turn is the 10 of spades. They check, and I decide to, after thinking for a moment, fire for 25. Now, our opponent ends up letting this go pretty darn quickly, but I still think this is worth discussing, at least for a moment. This is one of those where we can get second best continuance here, right? Because the board is now paired, I think a 5x hand is going to be far stickier. There are some 7x combos that we can get value from. There are obviously all of the spade and drawing combos on the straight as well. So I think there's enough second best stuff that can and will continue, and if they end up folding their equity with overcards or whatever, or even end up folding their equity with some draws, I'm okay with that too. Like, there's just a whole bunch of good things that happen by firing this, rather than checking this behind, having to face bets on some uncomfortable rivers. There's going to be some kind of weird river actions plus cards that aren't necessarily going to be the best thing in the world. The solver doesn't really particularly enjoy this, but I've found this works very, very well, especially in games that run a little bit tighter, so I'm totally fine with the overall play. Again, end up winning a nice little small pot, and onwards to the next one. In this last hand, we have ace queen offsuit. There's a limp under the gun. I decide to attack to 15, totally standard. Folds around to the small blind, who eventually ends up shoving it all in, a very angry look on his face, and folds back to me. So I'm not going to lie, this hand is not for you. This hand is for me. This hand is a pat on the back to James for not just automatically firing 50 big blinds against a nitty old guy with ace queen. This is the definition of discipline for me. It takes me so much to find a fold with ace queen preflop to not just get it in a situation like this, and I am very, very proud of myself for this one. It's just one of those where I can't really mathematically justify it. I mean, unless this person is just shoving wide, and I don't see that being the case, it doesn't matter. This is just not going to be a profitable commit for me. And honestly, this really is like the definition of discipline for me. I don't like folding ace queen preflop. I definitely don't like missing situations where I can take things that could be coin flips. It's just what it is. But the honest truth is that when I'm at a table where I can correctly get rid of ace queen preflop, it's probably a table that I'm very, very bored at, and that was definitely the case at this point. So I decided to say F it, rack up, and head on back. So overall, not a bad little session. Ended up playing for about 3.5 hours and made, what, $9.45 overall for roughly $270 an hour. no real complaints playing a little bit of 1-2, and whether or not you include that $500 high hand bonus, it's still a pretty nice session overall, no complaints whatsoever. And for what it's worth, if you're looking at some of these plays and you're like, I don't really fully understand it, or that seems good, but I don't really know how to put that into my playbook, I would definitely suggest checking out my post-flop workbook if you haven't already, and pay a special attention to the auto profit sections and also the value hands and the bluff hands part. That's going to help you a tremendous amount, and even the river play chapter when it comes to looking at things like that overbet on the river with that ace deuce, that is covered heavily in that river play section. So make sure to look for that and do those chapters, especially if you have the workbook already. If you don't, you can always get it today at splitsuit.com/postflop. Again, splitsuit.com/postflop. Jump into your postflop workbook today. And that is going to wrap it up for episode number 5. Hopefully you enjoyed. If you have any comments or questions, please do not hesitate to let me know. And of course, a like on this video would always be massively, massively appreciated. I'll see you back soon with episode 6, and in the meantime, good luck out there and happy grinding.